that like testing is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Now, I hope the testing companies do the right thing, and I think many of the people who work in these companies try to do it. But there's no doubting the fact that this is a major profit center, and it soaks up billions of dollars of public funding, and it's why it matters so much. There are all kinds of vested interests here. There are political interests at work too. So, and you have to. That's part of it being a complex system. So, I come from, I suppose, from a particular perspective myself, which is about wanting to treat people properly. I kind of broadly, kind of humanistic view of the world. And I believe that people have equal rights and they're entitled to them, and that education has economic roles as well as cultural roles, but they also has deep personal roles. So everything I say comes from that, from a respect for people. But if people don't share that perspective, they might quite happily talk about tolerating a 30% dropout rate, providing we defeat overseas competition. If you see people as disposable commodities, and some people do, then they're going to take a different view of it. So I would find myself in opposition to them.
Right. If you could see one fundamental change in your lifetime, which I know is probably the opposite of what you were just saying and being overly simplistic, but is there something you could see that could be done that would be a fundamental change?
In education?
Yeah, in education.
Well, yes, the increased trend towards personalising education is important. And I say that because the current system was rooted in its origins in the Industrial Revolution. And the premise of it is that there's all this stuff that people have to learn, and so people have to, largely, so to speak, bend themselves to the system. And really what I'm arguing for is a system that's much more oriented to individuals. I'm not arguing for a system that's kind of solipsistic and it's just about the individuals and only letting people do what interests them. It's very interesting. You spend an awful lot of time when you get into these debates clarifying for people who oppose you what you actually said in the first place. It's a tactic that starts to get a bit wearing after a while. People, I find it interesting. People who oppose what they think I'm talking about will claim I'm saying something I'm not saying, and then challenge me to justify it. I said, but I didn't say that in the first place. I don't feel obliged at all to defend a position I never held. And so, for example, people say, creativity is fine, but you have to, we've got to get the basics right. And I said, well, whoever said we didn't? Creativity is not the opposite of discipline and skill. It's not the opposite of knowledge. You need all those things. You can't be a creative filmmaker if you can't handle the camera, if you can't handle the equipment, if you don't have a depth of knowledge and discipline and skill in this. And you'll be a much better filmmaker for knowing an awful lot about filmmaking and genres and styles and all the rest. And it's true about writing. You can't produce serious works of literature if you don't ever read, or if you don't have a grasp of the language. You can't control what you're doing. You can go on and on with this. You can't expect to do something really fulfilling in a musical instrument if you don't know one end of it from the other. You have to. But it's about how these things interconnect. That's the point. So when I talk about personalising education, I'm not saying let's abandon everything except what happens to be of peculiar interest to every individual in the class. There are all kinds of things education has to do. One of them is we have to give kids a grasp of cultural traditions and circumstances. They need to know why they think the way they do, and that they're not the first people to occupy the earth, and they're not the first people to live in their part of the world, and they're not the first people to think as they do, and they think the way they do for cultural reasons, and there are influences there they need to understand and respect and think about. I'm just saying that in the middle of all this there has to be a proper respect that these are also unique individual lives, and that